All right, in this module, I want to think about remedies, which is to say, I want to think about what happens if you win your patent case. What can the court do for you? What kind of remedy can they give to the patent holder who shows I've got a valid patent, my patent has been infringed by the other guy? Now what? Remedies, kind of the bottom line of what we are fighting for when we finish the patent process. I want to think about different kinds of remedies, and I just want to lay them all out first, and then we'll pursue them step by step. If you think about what the court can do for you, they can do a couple things. For things that already happened, for the past, well, for the past, you can get cash, which is to say, it already happened. So what can we do? We can make sure you, the patent holder, are compensated. And I put here maybe tripled, which is to say, I can give you cash to make up for the harm, and then I could punish the other guy. I could, under patent rules, go as far as tripling and say, look, you should have paid $5, but I'm going to make you pay 15. And the reason is, I'm going to punish you for what happened in the past. We shouldn't have gone down that path at all. It's your fault. Patent lawyers say it's willful. And so cash may be tripled for the past. Okay, what about the future? For the future, I have two options, really. I have the option of getting an injunction. So the court might sometimes say, hey, stop. You infringe a valid patent. I can't fix the past. But as of today, or within 6 months, or whatever the transition period might be, but hey, you got to stop. An injunction ordering you specifically, don't continue to do that. Change the product, change the service. Right? That could be about the future. Or the court in some instances will say, I'm not going to stop you, but I'm going to impose a cash obligation. I'm going to put a licensing fee here. So if you want to keep doing this, you need to pay the patent holder the following number that I, the court, set, unless, of course, you negotiate something different, which is actually a point for both sections, as it were. When the court says stop, of course, then the parties can come and negotiate to keep going for a fee. When the court says, here's the number, of course, the parties can sit down and say, you know what, let's change the number and do something more interesting. Let's make a business deal. Let's do a marketing pact together. Let's work together over there. Let's make an adjustment. But the court, its forward-looking moves are either an injunction, stop, or cash. The third bucket of remedies, things the court can do for you, the patent holder, is while the case is underway, there's the possibility that the court can step in, which is to say, these other things happen at the end of the case. We go all the way, we go through jury, the judge makes its decisions, maybe we even run all the way through appeals, and by the time that's all done, we then have a list of things. This is what you owe, are we going to triple it, here's an injunction, here's the rules, and so on. That's all at the end. But you can, as the patent holder, ask, while the case is going on, help. So you could, and we'll talk about the details, you could step up and say, hey, my case is really strong, and I'm suffering for all these years of litigation. Don't make me do that. Step up right away. Give a preliminary injunction. Give an injunction just for now, a temporary early injunction to stop them now while we litigate. So 3 big buckets for the past, for the future, and during the case. And I want to walk through all these, but not in that order. I want to start thinking about injunctions for the future. And I'll be moving through all these topics, I promise, but I think the right way to think about them is out of sequence. And so again, I want to start with injunctions. When you think about the rules for injunctions, the lawyers, I would tell the quotes, right? Here's the test, it's this 4-factor test, and so on. For our purpose, I want to point out to you a couple things. First, there's a lot of discretion for the judge to decide whether an injunction is appropriate. And we're going to look at some of the issues the judge will think about. But there's a lot of flexibility for the judge to look at the situation and decide, is this an instance where injunctions are appropriate? Or might the injunction be abused or be counterproductive in some important way? And so, forgetting the details and the vocabulary of the law, I want you to realize that we argue for injunctions. Just because I have a valid patent that you infringe doesn't mean that I'm entitled to this relief. I'm going to ask for it, I'm going to tell my story, the other side is going to tell their story, and the judge has a lot of wiggle room to think about what the right move is. One of the stories the patent holders will tell is they'll say that patents are property rights, which is to say, remember the whole idea of the system. You come up with something cool, we'll give you a patent. And what is that? It's an exclusive right for a limited time. A property right. You own this thing for a limited time. It's yours and yours alone, even as against independent creation. Remember, it's yours. It's a property right. And so many injunction cases are very easy to argue. I remind the court it's a property right. And I have a fact pattern where it makes sense to think of it that way, where what I as the patent holder want to do is I want to say no. I want to stop the other guy from making that patented invention. I'm doing it. He shouldn't. Enough. He's a competitor, for example, and I don't want him copying my stuff. Many of the cases, this is all you need to say. It's a property right in a classic setup, and we're done. And let me show you a few examples just to help you see that move. I put up here a picture of the iPod. Apple, as you can well imagine, got a patent, among many others, on that little circle there that allowed you to navigate on your iPod, move from song to song, and so on. It was a nice interface that people liked. If Samsung had copied that circle, done the exact same thing, and we litigated the case, and Apple showed it's a valid patent, it was enabled, it was different from the prior art, the claim language was just so, and so on, if they prevailed in the case, they would then have a strong argument in favor of an injunction. They'd say, look, Samsung is our head-on competitor. They make these portable devices that go after our customers, just like we do. And this is our invention. We want to say no. This is a point of differentiation for our products as compared to theirs. It's a valid patent. Push them away. Let them go ahead and do a music device. No problem. We don't own that big idea. But let them come up with their own hardware and software interfaces. They're a competitor. This is a property right. Give me an injunction. Stop them until my patent expires. The classic story. Another classic story, but different, might be a story to tell about Intel. I put up here an image of one of the Intel chips. It turns out that Intel has patents on this chip and patents on other chips that Intel chose not to make. So when they rolled out the Core 2 Duo chip, they could have rolled out several other chips too, and they debated the different ideas. They chose this one, and they left a few others on the shelf. But they patented them all. And so if AMD were to show up and make one of those other designs, I take it Intel would have a very strong argument. They'd say, look, we have a bunch of patents. We made a business decision to leave these products off the market. We want to focus demand at the Core 2 Duo on this product. And so we're using our patents in the classic way. We're using it to encourage innovation, to get people to buy our products and support our research and so on. So even though we're not actually making those devices, that's part of a moat, a fence around our product. Stop AMD from doing it. Different from my Apple example in that Intel isn't making the patented item in this story, but same big picture idea. That's a competitor. We want to lock down these technologies. It's encouraging innovation, research, development, deployment. Easy stories. The stories sometimes get harder. Real case. Cigarette company steps up and patents a cigarette that is not addictive. They actually don't like that cigarette. Their research team came up with it. It's a cigarette that is completely unaddictive. But if you're a cigarette company, you kind of like the fact that cigarettes are addictive. So, like Intel, they don't want to put that cigarette into the marketplace. But unlike Intel, the story is a little less compelling here. A court might look at that and say, hang on, I get a lot of discretion here. And while I understand that patents are property rights and that you came up with this really cool new cigarette that is non-addictive, you're not putting it in the marketplace. And yes, that does help you sell traditional, horrible-for-you cigarettes. But not clear we're going to let the courts back you up on that. The idea of the patent system is to bring new useful things into the world. I might not give you an injunction. We might talk about cash. Might be if someone else uses that technology, they've got to pay you somehow. But injunction, harder story there. Another real example in that same ilk, I have my sheep up there. Remember Dolly the cloned sheep? There are some interesting groups out there that think cloning is wrong. And so what they decided to do is do a lot of research into cloning, patent all the interesting technologies and equipment they could think of, and then use those patents to get injunctions to stop other people from pursuing cloning research. Again, maybe a little like our cigarette case, where sure, patents are property rights, but come on, really? We're not going to let the court step up and allow the patent system to limit research that is otherwise legal. Right? It's one thing if the federal government were to say that's not legal work, and the federal government could always decide we're not going to fund that with taxpayer dollars. But to have the patent system stop innovation for policy reasons, harder story to tell. Another hard story in this category, the story of, hey, patents are property rights, I want to say no, is you might have situations, I put up the 4G logo, as it were. You might have situations where someone's licensed a lot of people. For instance, I have a patent relevant to 4G wireless. I've licensed 90% of the market, but for some reason I'm saying no to HTC. That might be an instance where, again, the court would say, oh, well, normally patents are property rights. Why are you saying no to just these guys? Maybe there's a good reason. Maybe there's something special about the economics of their attempted entry. Maybe there's something. But we're going to look hard. Because if we've seen you licensed to a lot of other folks, maybe we think we could go ahead and tell you license to this new party also. We know your licensing terms, which means we can suggest appropriate dollars. So look, you license to everybody else at 5 cents per device. License these guys too. So the property rights story is strong in examples like my Apple and Intel examples, but there are other examples, like the example of the cigarettes, the sheep, or why are you saying no just to me, where that story is going to resonate less. Another type of story when we fight about injunctions are stories where I'm not trying to say no. And let me just make sure that point is clear. All my prior points were points about the patent holder says to the court, give me an injunction, tell them to stop, and I will hold on to that injunction. I will make them stop. I don't want them cloning. I don't want them making a cigarette. I don't want Samsung making an iPod-like device, and so on. They were instances where the patent holder asked for the injunction and could look at the court and say, I'm going to use it. I'm going to use my power to say no. Now, lots of cases aren't like that, and that's the category I want to think of next. So sometimes I ask for an injunction, and I know and you know that I'm then going to turn around and say, all right, I could stop you. How much will you pay me to keep going? Right? The injunction is my first step toward getting you to negotiate with me. And this isn't bad. At a high level, the courts are very, very ill-equipped to figure out how much any given technology is worth. So the courts, in theory, are delighted if they could say, look, you're right, you're wrong. Right? Patent holder, you're absolutely right. Infringer, come on, you're wrong. And then give an injunction that forces the parties to go cut a deal. Patent holder, you have the right to say no. Guys, get together and talk about it. Right? As a court, I'm delighted to do that because I'm not good at figuring out, is this technology worth 5 cents a unit, 6 cents a unit, 7 cents a unit? I have no idea how to do that analysis. I'm really happy if I could just give an injunction and then trust that the market will work. That they'll go out and the patent holder will say, I have an injunction, I could stop you. And the accused infringer will say, look, I like your technology, but there is this other option for me. I like your technology better. I'd pay up to 10 cents for yours, but if you break 10 cents, forget about it. I'll do something else. And let them push and shove and argue and make a complicated, thoughtful, market-based deal. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if the court understands that you want an injunction to drive negotiation. The key question we have to think about is, will that negotiation work? Or if we send you to negotiate, is the market system going to end up giving us a crazy result? I'm going to say more about that in a second, but it's a real important point, right? I want to send you to the market to negotiate. Here's an injunction, go talk about it. If I think you'll do a reasonably good job at setting the right price, then I'd rather you do it than me, because as a court, I'm not going to do a good job. But if I know there's something about the situation, which means when I send you to negotiate, it ain't going to work out, the numbers will not be plausible, efficient, rational numbers, but a big mistake, then I might not want to give you an injunction to use that way. Let me show you some examples. Think about a generic drug. So I want to enter the market with a lookalike drug that's unauthorized. We'll talk about this in other modules, but for the purposes of this example, it's a nice example where if we litigate and the court says, you know what, that generic drug infringes a patent held by the main branded pharmaceutical company, i.e. generic, you're too similar. You fall underneath their patents. That's a scenario when maybe we give an injunction and send the parties off to talk. Right? We think they'll go out, the generic company will then say, hey, I can manufacture more cheaply, look at what I've figured out, or I can help you reach a different part of the market, look at my demographics look like, look at the insurance rules and how they affect me versus you. We'll talk about it and negotiate. And the injunction might lead the parties to go figure it out, and all the injunction's done is made clear that the patent holder has the right to say no unless a good business deal is there. That's an example at the high level where negotiations might work. I have Java up. Java is another example where the injunction might well be appropriate. Let me give you the background. Google, when they rolled out the Android operating system, they took a lot from Java. They took a lot of the programming conventions, the libraries, if you're a computer science person, but the details of how Java, the programming language, worked, how its environment was set up, how the variables were named, and so on. And Google took all this because they really wanted it. They thought to themselves, there's a lot of folks out there who already know how to program and work in Java. And so if Android looked like Java, we'd immediately have a whole bunch of partners making apps and software more generally that works with Android. So they wanted Java, and they even talked to Oracle, the company that holds the rights, and they said, we'd love to use this, let's make a deal. They couldn't come to terms. Google then took it, lock, stock, and barrel, took tons of information from Java. Fast forward, imagine we have a patent case, it goes well. Now I want to give out an injunction, not because I think the negotiation's going to go well. Right? At this moment, if I hand an injunction to Oracle, once Android's out and successful and lots of devices are using it, Oracle has a lot of leverage, right? Hey, Google, you're on the hook for massive damages. Hey, Google, if I say you can't do this anymore, what are you going to do with all those devices and all those customers? Right? On the one hand, an injunction gives Oracle massive leverage. On the other hand, in this telling of the story, it's the right result. Which is to say, we want to pile on, and Google should suffer at this point because they should have negotiated. They had a chance where they could have negotiated and done a market-based deal. Right? Before Google rolled out Android, when they were talking with Oracle, that was a beautiful moment to cut a deal. Google says, I'd really like to use Java, and it brings me this value. Oracle says, all right, but that's going to cost you. Google says, wait a minute, at that price, I'll do my own operating system from scratch. That's too much. Or I'll go cut a deal with our friends at Microsoft. Yeah, and I'll borrow from them. Or I'll go cut a deal with whoever. Right, but they jockey for position. They talk about the merits. They talk about the consequences of taking Java versus not. And they would have cut a deal based on market factors. An injunction in the case basically says, hey, Google, next time, do that. Right? We're going to force you to negotiate ex ante ahead of time. When that would work, right? That's perfect. When you know about them and they know about you, and before either side makes a big investment, you could talk about it. We wanted you to negotiate. So these are examples where even if I look at the court and say, I want an injunction, and I'm going to then go negotiate and withdraw my pound of flesh, fine. We think these will work. Let me show you some examples where it won't work. I have the Wi-Fi logo up this time. Motorola, it turns out, owns a couple patents on Wi-Fi. There are a lot more patents on Wi-Fi, but Motorola owns a couple. If Motorola sues someone who is implementing Wi-Fi without a license, Motorola, if it could get an injunction, would be able to get way more money than Motorola should. Right? Imagine, for instance, that I've licensed 998 of the necessary patents, but not Motorola's too. Well, when Motorola gets its injunction, they can hold hostage all of those other deals. Right? I've got it all lined up. I'm ready to go. And now Motorola says, so the only thing you need is me, eh? Right? They're in a great position that's not based on the merits of their technology. It's based on the fact in this story that there was 1,000 patents you needed, and you had some but not others. It's an example where if we give the injunction and Motorola goes out to negotiate, they might actually get themselves overpaid. They might get more than they would have gotten had everyone negotiated up front, because they can hold hostage the deals you've already made, the other patents you've already cleared. This is a key dynamic. I'm going to give you more examples. This is a really important dynamic. We want to give an injunction in a patent case where what would happen next is a negotiation that looks a lot like the negotiation that would have taken place had you negotiated way back at the beginning. Right? Because that's the world working. If we could get everyone to negotiate before there's infringement. So you figure it out, you go, you talk and negotiate. Those negotiations are going to be much more reliable than anything the court can do. So if you know about the patent and before you do any building of buildings, any design of products, you go and talk to the patent holder and you have that conversation. I like your technology. Here's my next best alternative. Here's what yours does for me. I could always do something else. Let's talk about it. Right? If we can argue about it when we both could say no and walk away, plausibly, economically, practically, we both could say no and walk away, that's a negotiation that should work, should be based on the relative merits of your technology. How much better are you as compared to the next best alternative? Great. If injunctions look like that, if injunctions lead to conversations that look a lot like the negotiation we would have had we done the negotiation right from the start, great. But if the injunctions lead to a negotiation that looks different, like my Wi-Fi example, where I can hold hostage stuff that's happened, right? So you already got deals with everybody, do you? I can make those worthless unless you pay me a king's ransom. Right? When it's going to look different from the clean ahead of time interaction, that's when we get nervous. Let me give you another example. The guys behind BlackBerry are one of the most famous victims of all this. Somebody had a patent, actually I think it was 5 patents, on the high-level idea of having portable devices that can be used to send messages and so on. After BlackBerry had majorly invested and built up its then successful business, everybody for a time carried BlackBerries. It was an enormously successful product and network solution. These guys sued BlackBerry, they won, and they said to BlackBerry, all right, we want to be paid, but let's not talk about what our technology is worth versus other little tweaks you could have done and so on. Let's talk about what's going to happen if you don't pay us today a lot of money. What's going to happen is we're going to take our injunction and we're going to shut your network down. So all those businessmen who have that phone, tomorrow, it'll go dark. And yeah, maybe in 3-4 weeks, you'll be able to make some changes to your network and stop using our exact technology and do something different. But for 3-4 weeks, you'll be dark. Police, government, all your enterprise customers, dark, dark, dark. We are going to hold hostage all the investments you've made that you can't change out quickly unless you pay us a lump sum of money that makes us happy. Right, and what's different about this move, what I want to make sure we all see, had they talked to the guys behind BlackBerry before, had this been a conversation before BlackBerry had made contracts, built buildings, built manufacturing facilities, been up and running, the conversation would have been about, all right, if your patent's valid and I do it that way, here's what life looks like. Here's my next best option. I can always do it this other slightly different way. And we would have argued about how much better your way is as compared to the next best. And that would determine how much you're paid. If you're a little bit better, you paid a little bit. If you're a lot better, you're paid a lot. If you're not better at all, bye-bye. Right? It would have been a conversation about the merits. However, in the actual case, and in many cases, when we get to the end of the case, the problem is that the accused infringer has already made investments. They have built buildings. They have signed contracts. They've bought supplies. They've made promises to customers and downstream partners. And the patent holder says, let's talk about how much you'll pay me to avoid messing that up. Right? Which is to say, the patent holder says, I can get an injunction and shut you down tomorrow. I can get an injunction and force you to change all of that. How much is it worth to you to avoid that? How much is it worth to you for me to not mess up your business? These are instances where the injunction would risk overpaying the patent holder. Sometimes the hostage value, the money you can get from threatening to disrupt the ongoing business, is worth a lot more than the technology itself was. And so these are instances where we get nervous. If I can go to the court and say, hey, if you give an injunction, we are going to negotiate. You're right. We'll make the number, not you. but the number is going to be ridiculous, not because it's such a great technology, but because I, the accused infringer, am vulnerable. And remember, distinguish this from my Java example. Google was vulnerable because Google made its own bed. Google knew about Java. Google took it anyway. That's why Google was vulnerable. No sympathy there. But in a case where I didn't know about your patent, for instance, and so I went up and built my business having no idea you existed. I didn't copy from you. I didn't know about you. I didn't learn from you. Nothing. Now we might be very sympathetic that if an injunction issues and we have to go negotiate privately, you're going to hold hostage all my investments. It's an argument against injunctions. Note, by the way, this can happen innocently. There's my stand-in for a very smart professor. Well, what if the professor has a patent? And it just so happens when a faculty member gets a patent, often it just sits on their shelf. They don't do anything with it. There's no great way to get it out into the world, although UCLA is better and better on this issue over time. But even if it's someone innocent, professor gets a patent, sits in it for a decade, looks up in the 11th year and says, wow, I just noticed that Microsoft is doing my patented invention. And the professor then goes up to sue. Here we have a good guy, a faculty member doing understandable things, but still just the pattern of facts puts them in a position where they can extort way too much money if they get an injunction. Right? They go to Microsoft and say, I just noticed you have a spell checker in Microsoft Word. I invented that. I patented those algorithms. You can stop. You can go and turn it off in all of the customer installations. You can try to make a change like that, but that'd be really cumbersome. So how about you just pay me a lot of money? Right? Same kind of thing. So it doesn't have to be that you were intentionally setting up this dynamic. You might accidentally go into it. My point to you is when someone is asking for an injunction, not to say no, but asking for an injunction to trigger a negotiation, the court will be very open to the argument and say, wait a minute, that negotiation will be systematically flawed. It's not going to be a good proxy for what we would have done had we negotiated from the start. Instead, it's going to be a hostage situation. We have investments that we've already made that they're going to hold hostage and charge accordingly. Okay, we started out with a bunch of things of what can the court do for you. Talked about injunctions. Let's go next here. And again, I know I'm moving around outside of this order. Intellectually, I think it's the right way to touch the issues. I talk about while the case is underway. While the case is underway, you can ask for what's called a preliminary injunction. And it fits here because we just talked about injunctions, obviously. A preliminary injunction is going to be an injunction that says, hey, during the case, stop them. Don't wait till it's over. Don't wait till you have all the evidence, heard all the arguments, met all the witnesses. Do it now. I need you to move now. And a couple of things I want to say about that. One, they're very hard to get for two reasons. One, because money later is often good enough. The court will often say, oh, chill, relax, litigate it out, let me really understand. And then if you're right, I'll make them pay you. Right? Money is often good enough. I don't have to stop the bad act right away. I can let it linger and I'll pay you. And the real issue here is often that the court says, oh, I don't want to have to figure out how much money. Right? One of the arguments here is that you can say, look, court, you're right, money would make me whole, but how are you going to know how much? It's a really hard process. And so we might argue about whether the amount of money can be figured out, but often this is the fight. Is money later good enough, or is it just so messy that we don't want to go down that path? Another reason these are hard to get is because often the merits are murky. Right? A court is not going to jump in and say, hey, stop your product line, unless they're really sure that the patent holder is right and the accused infringer is wrong. And these things are messy. You've seen a bunch of patents with me. Hard to read them, hard to understand them, lots of surprises come along the way. So because the court, on the one hand, is not going to be confident that it knows the right answer, the merits, and on the other hand, the court's going to think, oh, come on, we'll do it with money later. It's good enough. We'll figure it out. We'll make a good guess. We'll do it with money later. Courts are very reluctant to issue preliminary injunctions. That said, you can get them if the harm is hard to quantify. So if it's a harm where we don't think money makes it up, or a harm where we don't know how much money to give, right? There's going to be a big reputational harm, for instance, right? They're using my product. It's a medical device. Theirs are not as good as mine. People are going to get hurt. It's going to scare people away from this medical device forever. How are you going to undo all that, right? Where the harm is hard to quantify. And sometimes we say, look, the other guy doesn't have enough money. I know what the harm is. It's $80 billion. He won't have that much. Right? So if I can say that the harm is hard to quantify or I'm not going to get paid, if I can say the merits are clear, which is to say I can make a really clean showing up front that there really isn't a lot to argue about here, I'm right. And if I can show that I moved fast enough, which is to say it's very hard to ask the court to jump in right away if I have lollygagged for a couple years in filing the suit. But if I can get everything to align, I jumped in right away. They started to infringe, I sued them. Merits are clear, and I have a good story as to why money ain't good enough. They'll run out of money. You won't know how much money, and so on. In those cases, rare as they are, I can get a preliminary injunction, an injunction that will ride during the course of the litigation, and then at the end will switch to a permanent injunction like the one we've been speaking of. Okay, we've done injunctions for the future and while the case is underway. Next piece I want to look at is cash for the past. So again, things that already went wrong, can't give an injunction, it already happened. Got to think about cash. Patent law mainly talks about cash in two ways. They talk about paying you cash to make up for your lost profit, and they talk about paying you cash that would represent a reasonable royalty. And let's take a look at both. Lost profit. If I were to argue that I should get the lost profit, the profit I would have made had you not infringed, I got to make a couple points. I've got to first convince the court that I could have met that demand. So let's say I'm TiVo, real case, and I sue Dish for copying my DVR. And Dish, it turns out, sold a lot of DVRs. I would come in, and this is what TiVo did, and say, look, about 20% of that volume I would have sold. So, but for Dish, if they hadn't infringed, I would have directly sold those. I'm TiVo. I was well known at the time. I had a good device. I had the ability to sell those. I could have met that demand. I had manufacturing that was able to make that many units. But for the rest of the units, I admit, if Dish weren't in the market, I wouldn't have been able to make those sales. I couldn't produce that many units. I was only a little company back then. I wouldn't have been able to meet that demand. So in the real case, a real patent case between TiVo and Dish, TiVo conceded that, look, I want lost profit measure for the ones I could have made. Here's my evidence about my ability to ramp up my manufacturing. And for the rest, we'll measure damages another way, reasonable royalty. So one thing I've got to show is I could have produced the units. Another thing I have to show is that demand would have gone to me. So I've got to show that if Dish hadn't offered the DVR, people would have bought DVRs from me. This is easy in that example, but there are lots of examples where, if they hadn't bought the infringing product, there were 20 other products out there. A little different from mine, a little different from theirs, but in that same market, such that it's not clear that every time they made a sale, it really was eating my lunch. I've got to show a good correspondence that they caused me to lose sales, rather than changing the market in a harder to evaluate way. I've got to then quantify the profit broadly, which is to say, if I can show that I could have made that unit sale, I would have been able to make it, the demand would have gone to me. Now I got to talk about what profit I would have made on it, because that's then what you owe me, the profit I would have made. And to some degree that's easy, right? I show the profit I make on this unit in general, what's my markup, what are my costs, and so on. But I also can talk more broadly. So imagine, for instance, that I sell routers, and you infringe your patent, and you're selling routers that now infringe my patent. I show that I would have made those router sales. I'll then go on and say, look, had I made the router sale, it's probable you'd buy other equipment from me too. You might buy servers from me. You might buy extenders from me. You might buy a service contract from me. And all that's lost profit, right? Because you infringed and took away the router sale, I missed out on this whole convoy of profit. All these different services, all these different sales. So to the extent I can quantify that reliably, I can argue all of that and get it. Lost profit is another piece too that's real interesting, price erosion. So I could say, look, because you entered, I had to lower my prices. So I not only want lost profit measured by the units you sold, that I would have sold, I also want you to make up for me the profit that I would have made on my products had you not gotten in my way. I used to sell for 10, you entered, I sell for 6. That's $4 or more profit I would have made if you hadn't entered. So I want you to pay on your units, because that's lost sales to me, and I want you to pay on my units, because they were less profitable because of you. Price erosion. I note here, at-risk entry is dangerous. There are certain situations where a lost profit measure will swamp the profits you might make. And so you don't want to enter the market until you know for sure you're not infringing any patents. A good example here is generic drugs. As a generic company, if I enter the market, I drive prices down. That's what generic drugs do. I enter the market. Once I enter, every price comes down. I'm the lowest, I'm generic, but the branded guy comes down a little bit to try to compete with me. Well, hang on. If I enter the market and I'm wrong, I'm not making that much money. I'm the generic drug. I'm pretty cheap already. And once I enter generically, often lots of other generics enter also. So I'm making some money, but it's a pretty competitive market at my level. So I'm not making much money, but I'm causing massive lost profit because I forced the branded guy to lower his price and I'm taking away sales. People are not buying from him even at his lower price and are buying from me. And so if I lose the case, I made a little bit of profit, but what I owe, the profit he lost if I entered wrongly, could be enormous. It's a reason why at-risk entry is dangerous. It's a gamble where I am winning very little if I'm right and losing a fortune if I'm wrong. All right, that's the lost profit way of thinking about damages. There's also reasonable royalty. And as my TiVo example pointed out, sometimes this is all I can do. I can't show that I lost profit because I wouldn't have actually made those sales. Or it might be I'm not even in the business of making this thing. So I can't show lost profit because I'm just some university or professor. I don't make stuff. I don't have lost profit. I just like a reasonable royalty, please. Lots of instances where I can't prove lost profit well enough, and I want to go here. Couple things on reasonable royalty. One, this is all driven by hired gun expert testimony. I'm going to hire my famous economist, and he's going to say whatever the lawyers tell him to say about how much money you should have paid me reasonably. You're going to hire your famous economist, and he's going to say whatever your lawyers tell him to say about, no, come on, that's really not worth very much at all. It's a battle of hired gun experts, and I exaggerate a little, but only the tiniest bit. It's amazing what famous, well-credentialed experts are willing to say based on who hired them. And so you'll get this fight over credibility, and I hate to say it, but the jury and the judge is to figure out who to believe on often very complicated economics, right? They don't just walk in and have a simple little story to tell. They try to ooh and ah and make it all MIT level, and it's just not clear how well that whole dynamic goes. But built-in hired gun expert testimony, good job to be the hired gun expert, I should point out. Another issue with reasonable royalties, there's a wide open list of factors. So we don't give the court very sharp guidance as to what should and should not be admitted here. Instead, there's this long list of factors that you're allowed to point to if your expert thinks they're relevant. It's enormous. It goes on for pages and pages. I could talk about the history of these companies. I could talk about whether they're in the same market. I could talk about alternatives. I could talk about the licensing histories of both companies. On and on and on. Almost anything I can plausibly relate to a reasonable royalty. So it's a wide open list, leaves a lot of room for the lawyers and the economists to make the points they want to make. Third thing I say is to say it's but under a hypothetical negotiation. What's that mean? Well, the courts are told that the right way to think about the reasonable royalty is to imagine that the patent holder and the accused infringer got together before the infringement and negotiated. So there's a hypothetical negotiation. That's what we're trying to do in court. Imagine, they didn't do this, but imagine that they'd met just before the first infringement and had negotiated. And the courts are told even more, imagine that during that negotiation, both sides agreed that the patent was valid and infringed. Because remember, we're at the end of the case. If we're talking about damages, we're at the moment when we're saying it's a good patent, it was infringed, what's owed? So the court is told when you're doing that analysis, assume the patent's valid, assume the patent's infringed, and imagine what the conversation would have looked like. and an understandable hypothetical, but also somewhat extreme, somewhat different from the real world, where, when I talk to anyone, I always say, hey, I'm not sure your patent's valid. Hey, I don't know if I'll infringe. Maybe there's some ways I can work around. I got some other options. All that stuff gets skewed a little bit under the legal standard. Yes, my next slide is titled Worry, Worry, and I even began to plant those seeds already. Reasonable royalty analysis should give us great pause. There's so much here that can go wrong. I mentioned this idea of valid and infringed, right? Like I say, a real negotiation, the biggest thing we fight about is I say, I don't believe your patent's valid. I'm going to go get that thing blown up. I got ways. I'll take it back to the patent office. We'll fight about it. I'll go to court and I'll argue there that your patent never should have issued. Right? Usually, one of the things that drives our deal is you're nervous, I'm going to blow up your patent. In the court standard, we assume it's valid. I get why. We're at the end of the case. We decided it was valid. Of course, we want to factor that in. But wow. By assuming it's valid and infringed, we risk really skewing the numbers. Same thing, this idea that we imagine the hypothetical just before the act of first infringement. There might be a lot of hostages at that moment, right? I might have built my business, built the buildings, made a lot of deals, and I'm just about to roll out the product. And that's the moment the courts look at, right? Just before I infringe. But hang on, that's not actually when we should talk, right? If you want to imagine an efficient conversation, it should be before I make any invention-specific investments, before I built any buildings, any manufacturing lines, made any contracts, because that's the moment we'll have the best conversation. We'll talk about the merits of your technology, and I'm free to walk away. Never mind, you're being aggressive, never mind. I'll go do something else. But the courts don't do it then. The official test is just before the act of infringement, which might be too late. Another thing I want to make sure you worry about is the wild, wild west nature of this conversation. Remember I told you there are pages and pages of factors that the lawyers and the economists can raise. You can blind a jury with that much information, right? I can get a jury to believe almost anything if I'm allowed to go in so many different directions, tell so many stories, be so intricate about it. Who knows what the jury is going to figure out if I can have kind of a limitless presentation like this. And lawyers do this. Lawyers are good at this. Drowning you in information, pulling on your heartstrings, maybe not leading to the best analysis. The next worry I list is almost the opposite. The jury is drowned in information strategically, sure, but often they don't get the key information. So for instance, go back to my Wi-Fi example. If there are 1,000 patents relevant to Wi-Fi and Motorola is suing about 2 of them, if we really want to understand the value of those 2, we'd want to understand all 1,000. Right? How do Motorola's 2 fit into the big picture? How much do you have to pay for the other 998? Right, to really do the economics, we need to know about 1,000 patents. But there's no way. Right? The courts don't let me do that. Your Honor, I'd like to take the next 6 years and explain 1,000 other documents to the jury. Or I want to tell the jury that there are actually 200 other patents I haven't licensed either, so they shouldn't be too aggressive here because I got to save money for those cases. Really hard stories to tell. The court won't let them in because it's too much information. Sometimes it's hard to tell the jury about that complexity. Yet how do you set a price? How do you do a reasonable royalty analysis without understanding the ecosystem? I have more. I would say in juries using numbers. Right? These are normal people trying to do complicated math on huge numbers. Right? The sales of Microsoft Word in the United States over 10 years, that's a number far beyond what any normal person can think about well. And we see this. So for example, one of the biggest fights in patent litigation is about what number should be the royalty base, which is to say, let's say I have a patent on Microsoft Word and it's a patent on the spell checker. Can I tell the jury about how much money Microsoft makes as a whole? Can I tell the jury about how much money Microsoft makes on Office? Word is a part of Office. Should I just tell the jury about how much money Microsoft makes on Word? Can I just tell the jury how much money Microsoft makes by the people who buy the upgrade to get the better spell checker? Which of those bases can I tell the jury about? Which number do I say, look at this number and apply a royalty to it? Now, an economist would say, who cares? If you choose a really big base, I'll give you a correspondingly small royalty. If you choose a smaller base, I'll give you a correspondingly bigger royalty. An economist would say this is noise. Why are we fighting about it? Say whatever number you want, and then we'll adjust the math. But to juries, this apparently matters. Lawyers fight tooth and nail about putting up the biggest number they can find. Microsoft made this many billions of dollars last year, and I'm only asking for 0.01% of it. Right? They want to put up a really big number because they think the juries can't make the move of moving the royalty rate appropriately. Just one of many ways to say, really? Juries doing this? Last worry, I've got lots more, but just to get you worried about reasonable royalties. The last worry is this idea about arguing the alternative. In a patent case, if you accuse me of infringing, I'm going to argue your patent is invalid. I'm going to argue I don't infringe it anyway. I looked at your claim language and I don't do that. And then I'm also going to argue that if I do it, or if your patent's valid, if I do it, the number should be low. That's all fair game. It might even all be honest. I don't think your patent's valid. I didn't infringe it the way you wrote it. And I don't think it's worth much even if I did. That might all be true, but juries hate it. Right? Juries find that to be a little bit weasel-like. And so by the time you get to arguing with them about damages, as the accused infringer, you often don't have very much credibility. You're often in big trouble. And remember, you don't want to argue for a high number here. Right? You don't want to say, look, and they're right, if it's a valid patent, I infringed it, billions of dollars, take my firstborn child. So you're always going to try to argue for a low number. And you're doing it in a series of, you're arguing so much, enough already. Really hard to tell that story. So lots to worry about here. Remember they all stuck between a rock and a hard place? Damages and injunctions, both somewhat unsavory. Right? For injunctions, we worry that you'll get an injunction and hold hostage all my investments. Right? So I'll have rolled out my business, you'll get an injunction, and you won't say, let's talk about what my technology is worth. You'll say, let's talk about the harm to you if I disrupt you. Injunctions look messy in a lot of examples, but damages too, right? If we don't do injunctions, we got to talk about numbers, and numbers means juries working with complicated analysis from hired gun experts without much in the way of rules. None of it's very attractive. It's one of the reasons why we have to ultimately discipline the patent system to not give out too many patents. If I give out a patent on something lame, simple, too easy, that we didn't need this system for, what am I doing? I've sent us on a path toward this, toward ultimately fighting about damages and injunctions, toward ultimately having someone threaten someone else, hey, if you don't do what I say, we're going to court. Every time we do that, we're putting ourselves on a path to do something we're not good at. You either got to give damages or give an injunction, and neither works very well in terms of getting us to right answers. It's the strongest reason to be disciplined about not giving out too many patents. This should be a system where we give out patents for amazing breakthroughs that need this level of incentive system. And for normal stuff, stay out of my patent system, because we don't want to have to go to this unless we really needed the system to begin with. Okay, we've covered a lot. We've talked about injunctions. We've talked about preliminary injunctions. We talked about cash. Let me pick up the last two things. When you think about the future, if I don't give you an injunction, for example, in my sheep story about cloning, or I don't give you an injunction because I think you're going to hold up some hostages, now the court has to think about a forward-looking royalty. Cash, but forward-looking. What I'd been talking about was cash backward-looking, right? Lost profit for the harm that already happened. Reasonable royalty for the harm that already happened. But if I'm not going to give you an injunction for the future, and your patent term is still continuing, we got to talk about money for the future. The courts are still working on this. This is new-ish enough law that we don't have great things to say yet. Most courts look at the analysis that they already did for the past, and they start there, and they ask the parties, is there any reason to change the number? Should the future be more because now you know? Should the future be more because now you could stop and make some changes over the next year and get away from infringing? So we're going to raise the price and push you. They talk to the parties about why should the number be different for forward-looking royalties. The other piece I haven't touched on is this tripling idea. So again, for things that already happened, I'm going to give cash. And then if I think you are culpable, like Google was in my Java story, right? They knew about the patents, they took it anyway, I want to pile on. right? I want to triple those damages maybe. I want to pile on and say, look, next time, negotiate. Don't put us on this path to have the courts have to figure out the fight because you already did it. If you know there's a patent and you know you want to use it, go talk to them. Go cut a deal in the market where the deal and the conversation will work. So we triple damages. A couple things just to say about it. Totally up to the judge. So this is very discretionary stuff. The judge can do it only if you meet a particular legal standard for being willful. And that standard looks first to see if objectively reasonable people would have understood that the patent was valid and was infringed. And then also subjectively that you knew or should have known what was going on. So it's got to be a case where, man, it's pretty clear you were wrong and you either knew or should have known that you were wrong. If you meet that test, then the court can do up to triple damages. Most courts don't go all the way. Certainly on a big damages verdict, if you're already paying $100 million, not gonna ratchet that up to $200 or $300 million, most likely. Most judges use this to put a little bit extra on the table as a punishment if you really were extremely culpable. Again, everybody kind of would have known the patent is valid and infringed, and you subjectively also knew or should have known. So in a particularly culpable case, we pile on. It's designed to be hard to trigger, right? It's designed that's not easy. We don't want every case to end up with tripling and so on, because we want people to infringe patents that they honestly think are invalid, or they honestly think they have worked around. We don't want to make it so it's a very, very awkward gamble that if I challenge your patent, I pay triple, because then people won't challenge patents. And man, we need people to challenge patents. We issue hundreds of thousands of patents every year. Probably a lot of them are junk. And one of the best ways to find that out is to have people with confidence say, hey, I'm going to infringe that patent, and if you want to fight with me, I'll take it out. So we're careful about tripling, but it's there for egregious cases. Okay, those are the things the court can do for you in a patent case if you're victorious. And remember, in the shadow of that, we have a lot of conversations. So very few cases actually go to all this. We don't litigate all the way through, let the court decide, do an appeal, make those things happen. It's usually we say, look, let's negotiate. And if we don't come to a deal, then I just want you guys to realize we're going to court. I'm going to ask for this. I'm going to go for an injunction. Right? We have deals in the shadow of the law. And this is the shadow we have to focus on. If we can't come to a deal, knowing what we know, your view, my view on validity, your view, my view on infringement, we talk about this is what's going to happen. This is how the court will look at it. And in the shadow of that, that's when we negotiate.